I'm Lee from Frank Accounting, and joining me in Christchurch, I've got on the line on the video here Amanda Douglas from Wynn Williams. Amanda leads all the employment and health and safety practice for Wynn Williams.
Another question: if I have a force majeure clause, does that mean we can simply let staff go? The short answer to that is no. So unfortunately, with employment matters, there's always a process that sits behind it. So just in the same way that when you look at your employment agreement and it says we can terminate on 4 weeks notice, for example, you still need to have a process that sits behind it before you can then give that notice. And the same goes for the force majeure clause. But because of the events, so this is a force majeure clause, or some have got it phrased as a pandemic or major event clause, and natural disasters and things like that, you would be relying on that clause to then justify that shorter period and the circumstances that are surrounding that. So do a process, but let's be practical about it and pragmatic. Further question: if we terminate contracts under the force majeure clause, is redundancy still payable if their employment agreement also has a provision for redundancy compensation? The answer to that is going to depend on the wording of the clause. So, for example, as I said before, the clauses that we have drafted in the past postpone, either suspend or end any of those types of payment obligations by the employer. But we would need to have a look at the wording. Some may not be as clear on that, but if we are activating that clause and it is drafted hopefully correctly, then it is highly likely that we could avoid a redundancy payment depending on how that is worded. So we're happy to look at that for people if there's any questions or ongoing questions around that. Another question: we have a staff member due to finish up Friday. Can I make her use annual leave for the days we've been closed, or do I need to pay her as usual? So yeah, it's amazing how many people were having their finish dates sort of this week or next week. There's been a few questions around that. So the clear thing is that you should pay them their usual salary, of course, up until the last day that they have worked. And including any remote working days if they could do that. There's just going to be a line in the sand for this pay period is really what we're telling people. So you're going to have up until the last day of working the usual salary, and then from then on whatever you're proposing to do with your staff. Now, it almost is not worth consulting with someone who is finishing up on Friday. So it might be that you can come to some agreement with them, or worst case, perhaps just pay them the extra few days, depending on the ability for the company to do that, just to finish that person up, because consulting now for someone who's finishing on Friday may, potentially be a bit of a waste of time when there's plenty of things to be done. There's another sort of related question where someone is saying that the organisation has limited government support, and that Grant Robertson has said he would be very concerned about any business requiring staff to take annual leave or leave without pay in this lockdown period, and whether that was the legal point of view. That's actually our last question. Look, that I think is a little bit unrealistic. There are a lot of employers who are saying, well, we need to use annual leave. It comes down to that best efforts thing, I think, which is linked to the wage subsidy. And I know, that's only applicable to the wage subsidy. But if the employer objectively is doing everything that they can to make this work, and they are, don't have the slush fund and are not taking the mickey over this, but genuinely are doing what they can to tide their employees over, then I think that is reasonable, and that's what's required. And many employers are having to say it's leave without pay, or to the extent beyond the wage subsidy. And many are giving employees the option of using annual leave. And so if we put the annual leave in as something for the employees to comment on, or for them to request, should they wish to, then that's something that the employee would like to do. I don't see any issue with it. Of course, annual leave is a bit of a tricky one, because sometimes some employers can't actually afford to be paying out annual leave and don't really want to be advertising that. But some are saying, well, if I can see that termination is on the cards for maybe a few weeks' time, it might do me quite well to get rid of some of that annual leave in this way, rather than having to pay it all out on termination. But it, you know, from a cash flow point of view, which is not my area, it's you know, it's something to be careful of and to think about. Another thing around annual leave is that you can give notice if you can't reach agreement of the requirement for an employee to take annual leave. So if annual leave is something that does suit the employer, then you can give notice. You've got to give 14 days notice. But I was talking to one employer just before who said, well, I'm going to top up to 80% for 2 weeks and see how we go, but I'm also going to give notice on annual leave for 14 days time, so that we can start using that up. So, you know, that's what some of the things that some employers are doing.